The Florida Joint Center for Citizenship presents International Conflict, Video 4, Diplomacy. In this video, we're going to look at one way that the United States has approached international conflict, and that's through using diplomacy. After watching this video, you'll be able to understand one method used by the United States to deal with international conflicts, identify specific examples of international conflicts in which the United States has been involved, and explain why the United States became involved in each conflict and how that conflict was resolved. You'll definitely want to make sure you take a look at the other videos in this module to understand how the United States has approached international conflict. But for now, we're just going to look at one way the U.S. has approached international conflict: diplomacy. Just what is diplomacy? Well, diplomacy can be defined pretty simply. It's the work of keeping good relations between governments of different countries. You could also define it as a non-military way to try and resolve conflict. In this video, we're going to take a look at two conflicts that were resolved with diplomacy: the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Iran hostage crisis. By 1962, there was a lot of tension and conflict between the communist nations, led by the Soviet Union, and the non-communist nations, led by the United States. The Cuban Missile Crisis was part of that tension and conflict. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a 13-day conflict between the U.S. and the Soviet Union over the Soviet Union's placement of missiles in Cuba. Remember, Cuba is only 90 miles from Florida. The CIA flew spy missions over Cuba and spotted nuclear missiles on the island. If they were used, they could easily strike the United States. The U.S. Navy created a blockade so that nothing could come in or out of Cuba, including more missiles. Ultimately, through the use of diplomacy, the Soviet Union and the United States reached an agreement. The Soviet Union agreed to remove the missiles, and the U.S. agreed not to invade Cuba and to remove their own missiles from Europe and Turkey that the Soviet Union found threatening. Diplomacy had actually worked. It stopped the crisis from getting worse and actually helped end the conflict. Let's check in. Try to answer each of the following questions in your own words. Why did the United States become involved in the Cuban Missile Crisis? The U.S. got involved in this conflict when the CIA flew spy missions over Cuba and spotted Soviet missiles on the island, just 90 miles from Florida. What methods did the United States use to deal with the Cuban Missile Crisis? The U.S. imposed a naval blockade of Cuba and also used diplomacy. What was the outcome of the Cuban Missile Crisis? The U.S. and the Soviet Union reached a diplomatic agreement. The U.S. agreed not to invade Cuba, the Soviets would remove missiles from Cuba, and the U.S. would remove missiles from Turkey. Let's take a look at another international conflict where diplomacy played a role: the Iran hostage crisis. This is a 444-day period, beginning on November 4th, 1979, and ending on January 20th, 1981, where the new government of Iran held a large number of diplomats and U.S. citizens as hostages. Before 1979, the United States and Iran had a very good working relationship. In 1979, the Shah was the leader of Iran and was an ally of the United States. Eventually, though, a group of students overthrew the Iranian government and exiled the Shah. The revolution was inspired by a leader, the Ayatollah Khomeini, that did not like the United States, and when the Shah was granted asylum, or safety in the U.S., the revolutionaries tried to capture the last few Americans in Iran, the people living and working in the U.S. Embassy. They took dozens of American hostages. The president mainly used diplomacy and took other financial actions to try to deal with the hostage situation. The U.S. government froze Iranian bank accounts in the United States, meaning that people who had Iranian money here were unable to access their money, and the United States also stopped buying oil from Iran. Finally, through diplomacy, the U.S. and Iran reached a deal. The United States would release Iranian money that had been frozen, and they agreed also not to interfere with Iran's domestic affairs again. All the hostages were returned to the U.S. on the day Ronald Reagan was sworn in as president, January 20th, 1981. Let's check in. We've certainly learned a lot. Try to answer each of the following questions in your own words. Why did the United States become involved in the Iran hostage crisis? The U.S. got involved in this conflict because after the Shah was overthrown, Iran took Americans hostage. What methods did the United States use to deal with this particular conflict, the Iran hostage crisis? In dealing with this conflict, the U.S. mostly used financial actions and diplomacy. It froze Iranian bank accounts and didn't buy Iranian oil. What was the outcome of the Iran hostage crisis?
Iran and the United States reached a deal, and the hostages were returned on the day Ronald Reagan became president.
In this video, we learned how the United States can use diplomacy, or non-military ways to resolve conflict, to address international conflicts, such as the Cuban Missile Crisis or the Iranian hostage crisis. Diplomacy is an important tool, and oftentimes used to try to avoid military action or declaring war. Be sure to check out the other videos in this module to get a sense of how the U.S. has approached international conflict. Video 1, Declaring War, World War I and World War II. Video 2, Military Action Against Communism, Korea, Vietnam, and the Bay of Pigs. And Video 3, Military Action in the Middle East, Gulf War I and Gulf War II. This video is created by the Florida Joint Center for Citizenship. Thanks for watching.